Number one, good to be with you. Thanks, Hal. Thanks, Beth. Good to be back again, continuing this masterclass on M&A. So as Davis mentioned, it's been a pretty busy last 120 days. We've closed 4 transactions over that period, and that included the sale of Wilson Logistics Western Division to Ashley Furniture, private carrier. It also included the sale of a drayage company on the West Coast of less than $20 million in revenue. Also included Abenaki Carriers, which sold to Brown Bear Transportation, and also just recently the announcement last week of C2 Logistics, which we sold to TA Services. So a lot of activity, but also within that same window, there's been several occurrences where there was an owner, either a friend or a client, who desired to sell but was not able to exit on their timeline, on their terms, and that's why we're here. There's tremendous activity going on in the market. And this industry is not like other industries. That's kind of why we exist. And so our hope today is to kind of unpack some of the 16 most common reasons why trucking businesses don't sell. And I think through that, back to Davis's comment, I think that this is going to be an empowering session that puts you in control to control the things that you can actually control, while also becoming much more of the things that can have influence over the timing of a future exit. And just by being mindful of that, we feel like that's going to empower you to make good decisions and protect all that you've built through your trucking company. So with that stage being set, we're going to jump into reason number 1. Your trucking business won't sell. So reason number 1, stagnation. It's very simple. We say this a lot, especially to our clients and prospective clients, which is that you need a compelling growth strategy to capture the imagination of a buyer. So to kind of frame this, recently we were working with 2 different companies that were pretty much identical. They're both around 72 million in annual revenue, with adjusted EBITDA at about 14 million on that revenue stream. The difference was one basically had flat performance over the previous 4 years, whereas one had gotten to this place recently, had been growing about 20% year over year. So the question is, and you can chat what your response would be if you want, what was more compelling? What was more interesting to the buyer? Well, from a value standpoint, it's very clear. When people are valuing businesses, they're looking at what's the opportunity for return on investment and what's the lowest risk. Well, if they're coming in at a valuation point for something that's growing 20% year over year, there's much more cushion in terms of what if what could go wrong. So if they're trying to put an investment, they're kind of hedging against this trend of growth. And they're also understanding that if whatever I pay now, I'm probably going to double or triple that just in a matter of years based on what this current growth track looks like. So in that situation, you're either getting discounted or you're getting passed on something else that matches like the description that I just described. So that's the number 1 reason. If you want to sell on your terms, you need to be growing. And that's the takeaway. So we're going to move over. Davis, tell us about the reason number 2.
Yeah, number 2, we have owner dependence here. And so our bullet points here: greater owner dependence equals greater risk equals discounted valuation. And this is one of those things that I will say is extremely common in this industry because as a lot of you have experienced, but if not, you can imagine it's hard to scale a company in this industry without having some level of owner dependence to get it off the ground. A lot of times owners have to wear a lot of hats, from being the head of safety to recruiting to sales to maintenance, just to keep everything on tracks in the beginning. But as the business begins to scale, to whatever extent owners can decrease the dependence on them to empower the people around them to actually take on greater responsibility and to kind of work themselves out of a job to an extent, that decreased the amount of risk that a buyer is going to have to take on in actually being able to purchase that business and transition it over time. So I guess I'll make a little good news here, give you a little challenge if you're the owner of a business. If you're familiar with the proverbial business book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, they provide the principle of pay yourself first. I'm giving you full permission to go buy that fishing boat, get the golf club membership, whatever it is that you like to do that you don't have enough time to do right now. I'm saying go invest in it right now, just so that you are now pressured to get yourself out of the office to go enjoy that thing, and in turn empower the people around you to give you the opportunity to go do those things, because that will pay itself forward once you actually get to the table and look to transition the business, because that is going to, again, it's going to provide a greater valuation there. We had a client a few years back that had about $20 million in revenue. He had made a deal with a couple of his key managers, CFO, general manager, to give them a bonus at the time that the company sold, and an additional bonus, stay on bonus for them sticking around post transaction. And so what that did was empowered them to really take ownership in the business, and they did a great job of growing the business once they were kind of given the reins. And this owner ended up spending a lot of time as that business grew. He was taking routine trips down to South America to race dune buggies, which would not be for me, but it is for some people. And I can imagine he had a great time with that. So what that produced, and when it came time to sell, was we were able to produce 13 offers from 8 different buyers in 30 days for that business owner, because every buyer that looked at the deal, the risk associated with it was substantially less than what they were looking at elsewhere. They knew that these key managers were going to be valuable assets for them, and that they were bought into transitioning the business well, and that ultimately produced a greater opportunity for them at the closing table. So moving into number 3 here, inconvenience. I think we all have to deal with some level of inconvenience in life, but if you can imagine, if you're a buyer looking at multiple deals, the more inconvenient the deal is going to be to get the deal done, then the less time you're probably going to spend considering it. And the less time you spend considering it, probably going to spend less time valuing it. And so we had a whole story here. We had a guy that came to us this past year. He came to us and said, "Hey, I had someone reach out to give me an offer about a year ago. And at the time I was really busy. I was kind of in the weeds on a lot of stuff on the work front. I just didn't have time to respond. Would you guys mind kind of on my behalf engaging that person and just seeing if they'd be willing to honor that offer?" And so of course, reached out to that buyer and they said, "Are you still interested in this?" And they said, "Oh, well, yeah, we're still interested, but going to be honest, we've kind of already got our hands full with another deal right now." And so it's kind of accomplishing a lot of what we wanted to accomplish with the seller you're talking about. We'd still be willing to make an offer, but they threw out the number and it was about $6 million less. So the seller's lack of preparedness to actually be able to engage the buyer when the offer he ultimately wanted was presented to him cost him about $6 million in this circumstance. And so the ability to prepare yourself for an offer at any given time, whether you're trying to get out of the business now or 20 years from now, there's probably a number that would accomplish that. And having yourself and your team ready to respond to those offers is a great way to be able to ensure that you're not inconveniencing the buyer and making this a drawn out process where they can't get access to information, they can't move the needle meaningfully. Being able to have speed in response is a great way to offset inconvenience. Spencer, we'll pass it back to you for number 4 here.
Yeah, if you got eyes on that last slide, they're just to that end. We're not going to dive in there now, but we did include a link to a recent white paper, which is a 4-step guide to how to respond to an unsolicited offer. And I really encourage you to jump in there. On a side note, I do remember that, Davis, and there was also a personal thing going on that was creating that inconvenience. It was a wedding for his daughter that he had gotten tied up on. And so we said, I hope it was special, because that might have been the most expensive wedding of all time. So good dad doing the right things. But I think if you do that 4-step guide, I think that you'll figure out that responding, engaging doesn't have to be as burdensome as you might think it is. So dive in there, take care of that. Reason number 4, incompatible driver base. Now Davis and I, a few times or more a week, somebody will tell us if I could increase my business by 40% if I had drivers 1, trucks 2. The deal is it's not just about having drivers to grow business and to be able to sell a business, to be able to make those available. It's about having the right drivers. And I can remember being on a panel not that long ago with some very experienced acquirers, one a very large international acquirer in this industry. And the conversation came up about tell us about a time where you passed on a deal and why. Well, and he talked about, there was this deal. It had about 400 drivers. It was a decent sized transaction. We were excited about it. We were aligned as far as the economic deal points, and we got into diligence. And it turns out that, one of the main motivators was to be able to get this capacity through drivers. And it turns out that of the 400, the buyer discovered that his team had terminated 25% of those over the previous 18 months. So he's like, no, this is not accretive to me. I don't, because I'm not going to be able to successfully transfer these drivers over to my business. So I'm not going to experience that revenue. It's going to create some problems. So that's what the emphasis. The reason why it won't sell is because you don't have drivers that will successfully transfer over to the buyer. So in terms of meeting those safety standards and making sure that, do they have tenure? Are they jumping around all the time? Those things matter, especially in this environment when you have 30 to 40% driver pay increases that are becoming pretty common across the industry. So it's not just about having drivers. You got to have compatible drivers that are transferable. That takes us to reason number 5. Davis, hit us with it.
All right. Old equipment. I think we can all agree that truck in the background there is super cool. But if that's part of your fleet right now, we need to talk. So we need to make some adjustments. In this environment, the old equipment is obviously in a unique circumstance. The intermetal drayage world, people traditionally operate older equipment than you would in truckload over the road type of operation. But even with that being the case, in this current equipment environment, your equipment probably looks a lot more expensive right now if you own it than it did a couple years ago. And while that can be great to look at and to consider when you're thinking about selling, there's also a lot of challenges that come with having older equipment and the CapEx requirements that a buyer would then have as a result of making an acquisition. And not only that, the finding parts right now is a large issue as well. And I'll kind of get into that here in our next slide. But if you are a buyer and you're looking at two businesses with roughly $30 million in revenue, they have similar EBITDA, but one has a older fleet than the other, how do you choose? And you're probably going to go with that newer fleet every time. And so being able to have a newer fleet that is going to give a buyer more confidence they're not going to have to make continued investments in the maintenance of that fleet going forward, but also in this environment that they're going to have some assurance they don't have to, if they need to delay some sort of replacement schedule there, that they're not going to be in hot water. That's going to give you an advantage over other companies for sure. Kind of hand in hand that number 6 here.
Hey, Davis, can you tell that story about the recent transaction when we got into diligence and they had the requirement about the 500,000 mile limit as far as the trucks that they would allow in their fleet and how that affected the valuation in due diligence?
I know that it was going to require a lot of the equipment to be turned over immediately. And in this environment, the ability to actually allocate the additional power units to replace that was pretty unrealistic. And so had a pretty drastic impact on the deal there.
Yeah, I think what the math around it was about a price reduction of $3 million. And it was because of the lack of confidence that they could, in this environment, replace that equipment on time as they would in a different environment. So it had a material effect on the valuation because of what we're experiencing right now.
Definitely. Number 6 here, we have incompatible equipment and / maintenance. And a great example of how this came to play is we have a friend in the industry sold business a few years ago. And as she prepared to sell her company, she looked around at some of the people that she thought would be most likely to purchase her business. And she took note of the equipment they ran and got some information on kind of their maintenance schedules. And she just went ahead and implemented that into her business because she knew that when the time came for her to actually sell the business, when she brought the opportunity to these buyers, the fact that they had the same equipment in place and that it was a current maintenance schedule that reflected what they did internally, it was going to give her a much better opportunity to close. And that's exactly what happened. She got to sell with the company that she'd kind of long identified as the candidate she wanted. And as a buyer, if you're looking at a fleet that has all of one type of tractor, but you operate another, and you're looking at another opportunity that maybe is a little more expensive, but it's all consistent with the current equipment you're operating and the inventory that you have for parts, then it's probably no brainer that's probably an easier acquisition for you to take. And as we mentioned earlier, with the inconvenience being an issue, that is a potential inconvenience. Now, obviously, there's a lot of different companies out there using a lot of different equipment. And so it's not that most of the time a certain type of vehicle is going to be a deal breaker, that it's going to make it to where you can't actually exit your business. But what it's going to do is it's going to limit your buyer pool. And if there's potentially other problems on this list that are true, that's just one more reason for that buyer to potentially pass. And what we're trying to do is make it hard for them to find reasons to pass. So with that in mind, I'll jump over to number 7 here and pass it back to Spencer.
Yeah. And just to put some numbers around that, what I hope that you're seeing, what Davis just said, is that the more boxes that we can check here, is what's effectively happening is that the value of your business should be going up and the concentration of cash, the quality of the deal structure should be improving with each box that we're addressing through this. In that last situation, the result was approximately $100 million deal that was effectively all cash. And so it wasn't just because of that issue. She took care of a lot of these other things, but that wasn't a small issue for that particular buyer, just a little color. So the seller's valuation not based on facts. And I think that this is, and the reality is that the work that takes place in this industry is very difficult. It's one of the most demanding industries in the world. So when the owner of a great company receives an unsolicited offer and they're like, hey, and this is a common conversation that is shared with me. A buddy of mine, he's an industry friend. He comes to me and says, I've always admired your business. I think you have a great reputation. If you ever want to sell, and if you want to sell right now, I'd love to work something out. Do you have a number in mind? And it's just like, you don't know what to do because the person's been so busy building value and doing the certain things that there hasn't been a whole lot of consideration about what am I going to say when I'm inevitably asked this question. So there's typically one of two responses. One is, and this is them sharing this with me, which is like, hey, I don't know what to say. I think I'm just going to just pass just because I don't want to embarrass myself by saying something that sounds unintelligent or uninformed. So they don't say anything. They don't engage and they just walk away. Or the other camp of who's asked the same question, they might do something where I'm just going to say something so outlandish that if accepted, I'll know that I'll be content with that. Either way, neither are rooted in facts. It's just not helpful. And so when that takes place, like there's a lot of deals that probably could get done, well-intentioned buyers that want to pay a fair price that just like, there's just no starting place to work from. So if we move to the next slide, what I think this is really important. Like, so this is an analysis. This is kind of like a little software that we use just to help provide guidance around how we can get deals done and how we can structure deals and how buyers can positive cash flow deals. So oftentimes we'll have a seller who says, this is what I want. This is what I need. And well, if you want to get a deal done, we think here are some of the parameters that would allow us to do this. And we're basing that on market trends, but we're also basing on, an expected capacity to borrow from a buyer. And so when we're able to look at, hey, before we go make an offer, before we counter this, here's kind of where we're going to run into some issues as far as negative cash flow from a deal, while also producing an acceptable return on equity that the buyer puts into the deal. And so when we kind of have like these bright lights flashing as you see on this slide right here, it just helps us kind of pump the brakes and to say, hey, I think this guy's going to pay an aggressive price. I'm going to respond as aggressively as I can without scaring him away. These are the types of instruments that allow you to push as far as you can and kind of strike that balance. And so I think that's the whole deal. The reason why they don't sell is because they're not equipped to respond in an informed way. And that's something that you can easily address and move on to the next deal. So the next thing that I would talk about is reason number 8, which is seller rigid with the sale. And so a lot of times this just, again, comes from lack of experience or just having some inexperienced advisors in your circle, which is not necessarily helpful. So sometimes we'll come and we'll have a deal and buyer and seller like the deal points, they like one another. And then someone within the seller's advisory circle will say like, well, hell, you shouldn't do it unless it's a stock sale, because that's where otherwise you're going to get killed in taxes. And so this is what I would say about that. Number 1, that's not true. Number 2, that's not how deals are done. You either get the favorable business valuation or you get the favorable tax treatment. You typically don't get both. And so knowing that, there's just so many ways to skin that cat. So if you go in with a mindset that it has to be this way, it's just counterproductive. Buyers have needs, seller has needs. There's a variety of different things that can be done from a deal structuring and a tax strategy standpoint that can allow everybody to address their respective goals in a way that makes sense. So just keep an O in mind. Don't take any hard, absolute positions, and there's a great chance that this won't affect you. So moving on to number 9, Mr. Davis, unreliable record keeping. Talk to us, sir.
And if they would have let me put an office image on every one of these slides, I would have. But I did manage to get one in here. So, with unreliable record keeping, bad records equal discounted price, unforced errors equal unacceptable. And so this is the world that I live in a lot on the front end of our deals. I spend a lot of time, even going back to some of the valuation conversations Spencer just mentioned. I have a lot of those conversations on our behalf. As people come to us and say, hey, I'm considering a sale, guess I'll give an offer right now. If you are ever just wondering high level valuation type of numbers, I'd be happy to just jump on a quick call and give you a quick understanding of what we would expect. But one of the first things we're going to do is ask for some financials. And I can quickly kind of tell if there's going to be red flags once we see some financials and the amount of detail that's involved there. As we're trying to give buyers confidence, we're trying to reduce risk as much as possible. If we have unreliable records, then all that's going to do is it's going to decrease the buyer's confidence that what they're buying is truly what they're buying. And so we had a deal recently that should have died. The buyer lost about $3 million in total consideration from the buyer because they wouldn't recognize a portion of the EBITDA after due diligence. They just didn't trust it. And it was one of those things that it was kind of narrative form. It wasn't, we couldn't just point firmly to the books and justify this. And as a result, instead of getting that at cash at close, it turned into something where they said, okay, we'll potentially give that to you, but it's going to have to be through an earnout. And so our client was still able to capture that, which is great. But the risk there was greater on them. They weren't, for some reason, something unforeseeable had happened. In that earnout period, they had the potential to lose out on $3 million that had they just probably kept their books better in a way that is completely possible. Anyone is capable of keeping clean records and producing detailed financials. Had they done that previously, then they wouldn't have had themselves in that position. And so that's a good end of that story. There's other stories where we routinely have people which say, hey, like, we're going to have to send you to someone to kind of get your books in shape. And it's probably going to take a year before you're actually in a position where you can produce financials that are going to satisfy a buyer's request. And so if you are familiar with the guys at Moss Adams or Catsapper Miller, do a lot of work with them. They're specialized in trucking logistics and are great CPAs. They'd be great people, resources to reach out to have a conversation if you could use a little help on the record keeping front.
And I was just going to add, Dave, so I would add Clifton Larson Allen to that list as well. And just to Davis and I did a boot camp a while back about just getting your financial house in order. It was a whole separate webinar about doing this. And a couple of things, like if you can't produce monthly financials like every month by the 15th of the following month, like if your people aren't doing that for you, fire them right now. Like they have to be able to do that. Like otherwise, like you're never going to get on the dance floor. And the thing that I want you to consider is that, like, in this environment where people can't really grow without drivers and they can't really grow without trucks, acquisitions it's becoming such an active market. You have to understand that you're not just being evaluated by yourself. The people that are most capable, most interested in acquiring your business and paying the most money for it are probably looking at 3 to 4 deals at any given time or more. So if you can't check this first box right out the gate within the first 48 hours, like it just becomes very easy to pass on your deal. So don't be that person. Satisfy those things and give your business the full opportunity to be valued the way that it should be. That's it. Which brings us to reason number 10, sir. Sorry.
Minus an office reference here, but important nonetheless. Customer concentration versus no accounts. So I guess what we could say here is customer concentration and no direct shipper relationships. So too much revenue in one account equals high risk. No real accounts equals low buying interest. So routinely, again, this is something we encounter a lot. And most businesses, in order to scale to some sizable amount, have to have some level of customer concentration to get them there. There's exceptions to that rule. And so understanding completely why that happens, how you want to maintain good rapport with your large customers. As they ask for more, you want to be able to deliver because they account for a large part of your revenue. But in terms of mitigating risk, if for some reason there was to be a major change up in that customer, and maybe they got acquired by someone and they had different shipper relationships or whatever that is, the risk to a buyer is severe. And so to the extent that we can decrease the amount of concentration across our top customers, the more that's going to increase a buyer's confidence, decrease their risk, and increase the value associated with that. Again, there are exceptions to every rule. Deals do get done with high customer concentrations, but what it does is it just shrinks your buyer pool. It shrinks the amount of people that are going to be able to get comfortable with it. And potentially it's just one more box that they have to check that allows them to pass on the deal. And so in the same vein, if you are receiving all your freight off of load boards, or your main customers are 3PLs that are 100% related to the spot market. On one hand, you're probably having a great year. You've probably had a great couple of years, and there's a lot of value to that. But at the same time, in a buyer, it's tough for them to value that. It's tough for them to say that there's any long-term customer relationships there that they can kind of use to give confidence that those customers are being served well, and that they're not likely to go seek business elsewhere, or even better if there was customer contracts in place. But it's hard to value a spot market account or spot market freight or offload boards, anything like that, because who's to say what that freight's going to be worth tomorrow? Maybe you have the same amount of loads, but as the spot market moves, a buyer can't look into their crystal ball and say, hey, for the next 6 months, this is what the spot market is going to do versus, first 18 months. And so a lot of times buyers just, are not going to be willing to touch that freight. And if they do, they're going to severely discount it, that portion of your revenue. So the extent that you can decrease your customer concentration and increase your amount of direct shipper relationships, that's going to bode well for you. All right, passing it over to number 11 here, Spencer.
All right, limited consideration of tax implications and strategy. So I think we can all agree taxes, no fun. Nobody's really excited about doing that. I think the reason why companies don't sell is that people make broad assumptions about what are the tax implications going to be from a sale. And as a result of that, they don't fully engage to a process, and that's a major mistake. So for a glimpse into how we operate, and this is very key, if they haven't done it already, what we're trying to do with our clients is once we have assessed the business, we understand how the market's likely going to respond, both in terms of value and deal structure, complexion. We want to loop in wealth advisors and tax strategists to help us understand what can be done before and after this sale to mitigate unnecessary tax liability. And so what that does is, number one, it educates, but number two, it gives confidence for for sellers to confidently respond to proposals as they come in. And so what happens in these conversations? Well, business owners who've built a business, who are planning on retirement, are very sensitive about net proceeds. They begin to get confidence. Recently, conversation, I said, hey, how did it go with the wealth advisor? He's like, well, I learned about investing in opportunity zones as a way to try to mitigate my tax exposure. I learned that I might be able to create some leverage to use very cheap interest loans to pay for tax. I was like, wow, that's great. I'm glad that you had those conversations. Is that helping you get confidence? He's like, yes, I feel very confident that there's a lot of ways we can get a deal done now that I don't have this 50% tax bill that I thought I was going to get, which it wasn't even close to that. So the point is, if you're not having those conversations, it's very difficult to function at a high level, to do your best from a negotiating standpoint, and to make it to the finish line. So the reason is this, just do your homework, align yourself with the right advisors. It doesn't mean that you have to act on that information, but just getting the information is half the battle, just to get to effectively navigate through the process, which is very complex. So that's reason number 11. Reason number 12 is not a fun topic, but unfortunately it's very real: lawsuit or a fatal accident. Now, this is the world we live in, guys. Every day that you got trucks on the road, this is a possibility. So my encouragement to you is that as a business owner, you know when you're done, when it's time to pass the torch, to select a trustee to move the company legacy into the future. The reason why businesses to get sold is when people know that that's true and they just don't put action around it. And as a result of that, fatigue sets in, operations get sloppy, and they start making mistakes, but particularly around safety. And that's where you start having these fatal accidents that have irreversible consequences, both in terms of your ability to control the timing of an exit, but also just the economics of it. There's just some lingering exposure and liability that once you've had a fatal accident, that people don't want to touch it for a while. And if they do want to touch it, only under certain economic conditions will they buy it. And so that's the thing. When you know, that's when you have to pull the trigger and get out quickly, so that risk is no longer on the table that could affect your ability to exit when you want to. That being said, we'll go ahead and jump to number 13, inept attorneys. Yeah, we're lucky to have a lot of great industry attorneys that know our industry, that have been around M&A, and I'll tell you some names here in a second, but it's very easy when we get to the point, we've agreed to the terms, maybe we're at LOI or even the purchase agreement, and we need legal professionals to paper this document to protect any potential unnecessary legal exposure. You need someone who specializes in doing this. And where deals die is when you bring amateurs or people that don't specialize either in M&A or in transportation or both. And I could tell you countless stories, unfortunately, about friends that are attorneys that run up $80,000 worth of fees, don't get a deal done, potentially lose a deal. This is not a good practice. And so there's lots of folks that we interact with regularly, whether it be Scudder Law, Scopelitis Law Firm, Benish Law Firm, just to name a few that are tremendous resources. We had a large deal that we were working on here recently, over $100 million. And our client felt very strongly about a very reputable law firm that he'd done a lot of work with over 20 years. And we said, that's fine, but we would still encourage you to have a conversation with someone who understands this industry. They had a 30-minute call, and just through the questions that the industry specialist was asking, immediately they agreed to hire this firm. We didn't say anything. They said, just have a conversation, but it was so clear that they understood the nuances of getting that deal done. They believe like the probability of us closing this deal just tripled basically just after this conversation. So that's one of the main reasons why deals don't get done, but it's also the easiest thing that you can correct to make sure that you put some insurance around a deal and get to the closing table. So number 14, a health crisis. Davis, we've seen some things, haven't we? Unfortunately, the nature of what we do. And, a lot of people that we are helping exit the trucking logistics space, they're 50 to 75 years old. I mean, that's the common profile. And with that, you add the unbelievable stress that this industry puts on business owners and how that affects their health. Unfortunately, we see this play a role much more often than we'd like. And so the main takeaway of this is I'm not going to dwell on this, but it's very difficult to successfully maximize a sale behind a health crisis or during a health crisis. It's just because, unfortunately, business is business. There's vulnerability there. The buyers know that there's limited leverage from the seller standpoint, and that's just not a place to be in. So if you kind of reverse engineer that, you would prefer to sell when your business is at its highest, your health is at its best, and you have the physical stamina to add a sale process on top of what's already a demanding job day to day. One of my favorite examples of this, we had a client and he committed before he sold his business, he lost 40 pounds. He said, if I'm going to go through this, I got to get in peak condition. And towards the end of the process, we went to a final all hands negotiation, and we had stayed at the same hotel in a different city. And I got up to go work out in the morning, and I got there to the gym. It was 5:30. And my client, who was 60 years old, was just crushing it in the gym. I said, we're going to win today. We're going to win this negotiation today. And I think that's the idea. And as far as that's how you win. The reason why deals don't get done is when you run out of gas too soon. So you need to exit while your stamina and your endurance, your health is on top. So you have maximum leverage and you're never forced to do anything that you don't want to do. That's my encouragement. All right, sir, bring it home for us on number 15 and 16.
Right. Upside down balance sheet. And we have a great example of how this has negatively impacted someone recently that we've run across. They're about $50 million in revenue and great business, but the owner actually recently replaced a significant amount of equipment, like completely overhauled his fleet. And in doing so, took on a significant amount of debt. And so what that did is just, it really made a transaction tough for him. The valuation of the company didn't drastically increase. The earnings stayed relatively flat initially, but after a couple of months, a couple of issues came up that made some distractions in the business. EBITDA dipped, and so by the time he got to us, what was previously $10 million in EBITDA was about $7 million, and as a result of that $3 million EBITDA dip plus the pretty excessive amount of new debt on the business, it just made an exit pretty tough for him in order to satisfy what he needed to kind of step into the next season of life. So don't hear us say, again, based on the previous conversations, that you shouldn't replace your fleets, that you shouldn't take on debt to sustain a business. Timing matters, though. If you're looking at an exit in the next handful of years, then you have to also weigh the implications of what taking on that debt right now is going to do to your ability to accomplish what you want at the exit table in whenever that is. And also, the risk of taking on the debt is not solely in the debt itself, but what are the implications of having that debt and then one of these other issues arising, and what sort of position that puts you in. And so, again, to the extent that you can keep your balance sheet clean, that you can keep yourself in as much of a low debt situation as possible, that's reasonable to continue to operate the business. That's going to give you more options in terms of how you can structure a deal, how you can actually accomplish what you need to through a transaction to capitalize on the upside there. Moving to number 16 in our final-ish reason here, external factors. So the best buyers, too busy absorbing another deal, market crash, correction, or interest rate spikes. Obviously, there's a lot of things that you can control within the day-to-day operations of your business, but there's a lot of things going on in this world that none of us can actually do to meaningfully alter on a day-to-day basis. So as you're looking at, right now is now a great time to sell? Yes. Does that mean that it's always going to be a great time to sell? No. And so making sure that you're taking into account as you build the business, if you're looking to maybe have an exit 5 years from now, what could happen in the next 5 years, either from the market or from a personal kind of unforeseeable circumstance that could influence your ability to sell. This industry has an aging owner demographic. And so as a result of that, there's going to be continued M&A action in the space for the foreseeable future, whether the market moves up and down. But what that's going to do is, as there's more buyers in the market, or continues to be more sellers in the market, as there continues to be more sellers in the market, you're going to need to find ways to differentiate yourself, as we've discussed previously, and that are going to actually give a buyer confidence, whether the market is up, whether the market is down, whether we're in a recession or whether we're not. There's simple practices that you can do to actually give yourself the best chance there. But if some of those things are not in place and there is a large macro shift or something that takes place outside of your operation that affects you at large, then that could be a significant factor for why you don't sell. Is there a story you mentioned earlier there about a labor lawsuit that was kind of external on the buyer front that kind of influenced that? Do you want to give some color there?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is just part of the deal, is that the recognition that you can do all the right things, have the right buyer, have even the right valuation agreed to, but there's certain things that you can't control. For instance, if the buyer absorbs another acquisition, or if they have a lawsuit, which takes their ability to engage off the table for a year or two. Like if you have a health issue or whatever the deal is, you have only one of two choices. You can either wait if you have the health to do that, and if your business is healthy enough to do that, or you have to make material deal concessions that you didn't want to do and shouldn't have to do. So I think that just when you're mindful about this, is that it rarely works out. I mean, I've almost never heard, Davis, you've been doing this a bit too, but I don't know if I've ever heard someone say I've sold too soon. And I think that's the issue, is because usually, we had a client that came to the table. He had the buyer. He knew the buyer that he wanted to do. We got the terms agreed to. The situation I just described took place. He was only 52 years old, business doing fine. He just pressed pause for 2 years. And then we came back. He conceded nothing, got all cash offer, and that was it. But if he's 67 and he's in that position, his action is different at that point. And so I think that's the takeaway, as far as you kind of have to build in time around that. And then we'll have a resource here in a minute that will show you that. I think that will provide some color in terms of how to kind of map that out. on your own.
Yeah, I guess before we jump in these extended resources, I'll give a couple of bonus reasons right here. I gave number 17 to our friend Ryan Scriber already this week. You didn't work with Ryan because he hyped us up on LinkedIn, so that's shameless. I'd say number 18 though, really just a quick shout out to IANA. We get to work with a lot of organizations and a lot of associations, and if you're not a part of their organization, I would definitely recommend you do. There's so much that can be gained just from plugging into the network associated with the association, but also the resources, the educational opportunities that can actually help you kind of stay ahead of a lot of these potential pain points and continue to keep yourself in a position to grow your business in a way that is going to demand a greater value down the road. And IANA does a great job of really investing in their membership. And so they didn't ask us to do that. We think highly of them, and we wanted to give number 18. Might just be that you didn't join IANA soon enough. So that could be it. Spencer, you want to finish this off here with some of these extended resources?
Yeah. So we've got an owner guide, when to start a sale process, which basically maps out every stage of the sale process and the things that you can't control that could create delay. It's not to create fear, it's to create confidence that you'll understand and be able to kind of take more ownership over what you want your exit to look like. And then there's the kind of expanded version of the white paper of 16 reasons why your trucking business won't sell. So we hope that provides you the ability to kind of come away from here along with the guide for responding to unsolicited offers, 3 separate white papers built within this deck that we think that you can go put some action around immediately. So from a conclusion standpoint, it's very simple. Like if you want to exit on your terms, on your timetable, there's no excuses. You have to focus on what you can control, and you have to educate yourself on the factors that you can't, and be very mindful of those things. And if you do those, guys, the results are this. You're going to have a much better experience whenever that is. And it's typically going to be a higher business value, higher concentration of cash, more influence over selecting the right trustee to take your business in the future. And that's what we want for you.